Watauga Settlement, North Carolina frontier, February 1837. While neighbors huddled around standard fireplaces that devoured cord after cord of hardwood, yet left cabins frigid by midnight, one family slept comfortably through 17-degree nights, burning half the fuel. The difference? A hearth so massive that experienced builders called it lunacy. What did this German stonemason understand about thermal physics that American-born craftsmen dismissed as old-world foolishness? Before you find out, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. This is knowledge our ancestors paid dearly to learn, and it's worth preserving. Drop a comment if you've ever seen one of these massive hearths in an old homestead. Jakob Steinmann arrived in the Watauga settlement in October 1836 with his wife Anna, 3 children aged 4 to 11, and a reputation for excessive caution that bordered on paranoia. A stonemason trained in the Black Forest region of Baden, he'd survived 2 brutal alpine winters in poorly heated lodgings during his apprenticeship, an experience that had nearly killed his younger brother and shaped every decision he made about his new cabin on the American frontier. The Steinmann family had purchased 40 acres of timbered land along Meat-Camped Creek, where the valley narrowed and winds funneled down from the higher elevations with particular ferocity. It was good land for timber and water access, but locals knew it as one of the coldest microclimates in the settlement. When Steinmann selected this property, some neighbors took it as further evidence of his poor judgment, a newcomer who didn't understand Appalachian weather patterns. When he began laying the foundation for his hearth in early November, neighbors gathered to watch with growing disbelief. The excavation itself was unusual. A pit nearly 3 feet deep, filled with carefully fitted fieldstone to create an insulated base that would prevent ground frost from leaching heat downward. But that was just preparation for what came next. The firebox alone measured 4 feet wide and 30 inches deep, dimensions that made experienced builders shake their heads. Most frontier fireplaces featured fireboxes between 24 and 30 inches wide, sized for quick heating and manageable wood consumption. Steinmann's firebox could accommodate logs that would take 2 men to carry. But the firebox was just the beginning of what neighbors considered his folly. Steinmann was constructing a thermal mass that extended 18 inches into each wall on 3 sides of the firebox, creating a U-shaped stone structure that dominated the entire north wall of his cabin. The hearth consumed nearly 60 square feet of floor space in a cabin that measured only 20 by 24 feet total. He was dedicating more than 12% of his living space to stone. The structure weighed over 4,000 pounds, more than twice the mass of a conventional frontier fireplace, and nearly triple what some of the lighter fieldstone designs weighed. "You'll burn through your entire woodlot by January," predicted Thomas Bradley, a builder with 15 years of frontier experience and 12 cabins to his credit. "That monster will suck heat straight up the chimney faster than you can split logs. The draft alone will pull cold air through every gap in your chinking." Bradley's own cabin, visible from Steinmann's property, featured the standard design he'd perfected, a modest firebox with minimal stone surround, built for quick heat and efficient draft. The stone extended perhaps 6 inches beyond the firebox on each side, enough for structural integrity and some heat retention, but nothing excessive. It was the accepted wisdom of the region, proven by a generation of settlers who'd survived Appalachian winters successfully. Other builders agreed with Bradley's assessment. Samuel Perkins, who'd built more than 20 cabins across 3 counties, examined Steinmann's foundation work and declared it a waste of good stone and better labor. The settlement's informal consensus was unanimous. The German was building something impractical, expensive in both materials and effort, and fundamentally misguided for frontier conditions. Steinmann's response was quiet but firm, delivered in the careful English he'd been practicing since his arrival. In the Schwarzwald, we learned that stone remembers warmth longer than air does. My grandfather's hearth, built in 1762, kept his family warm through winters that killed cattle in their barns. The stone was the reason they survived. Bradley laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of a man who knew he was right. This isn't the Black Forest, Jakob. Different timber, different weather, different methods. You'll learn. The story of the Germans' folly spread through the settlement with the speed of genuinely interesting gossip. By December, when Steinman was still hauling sandstone from specific sections of the creek bed, rejecting perfectly good stone in favor of particular pieces he claimed had better density, even sympathetic neighbors whispered that he'd be splitting wood until spring while they slept comfortably beside their efficient, proven hearths. Women at the settlement's Sunday gatherings asked Anna Steinman if she'd tried to talk sense into her husband about the excessive hearth. Anna, whose English was less developed than Jacob's, simply smiled and said, "He knows stone. In the old country, his family builds for 200 years." The response was met with polite nods and private concern. 200 years of European tradition might mean nothing in the Appalachian wilderness, where conditions and resources demanded different solutions. What they didn't understand, what their American frontier experience hadn't taught them, was the fundamental difference between convective heating and radiant thermal storage. Steinman wasn't building a fireplace designed to heat air quickly and send it up the chimney. He was building a battery that would charge with heat during evening fires and discharge that warmth throughout the night, maintaining livable temperatures long after the flames died to embers. He was building a thermal mass precisely calculated, not through mathematics, which he'd never studied formally, but through generations of accumulated wisdom encoded in specific dimensions, stone selection, and geometric relationships that Black Forest masons had refined across centuries of alpine survival. The physics were simple to anyone who understood heat transfer, but the frontier consensus had already decided he was wrong. And consensus, particularly among experienced men who'd proven their methods through survival, is a powerful force. By the time Steinman mortared the final capstone on his chimney in late December, the entire settlement knew his name, not as a skilled craftsman, but as the stubborn German who'd built the most expensive monument to Old World ignorance the Waudiga Valley had ever seen. Steinman's hearth defied every convention of frontier construction, and for good reason. Each element served a specific thermodynamic purpose that standard fireplaces ignored entirely. What looked like excessive size and wasteful mass to frontier builders was actually a precisely engineered thermal storage system based on principles that European masons had discovered through centuries of cold weather survival. The sandstone itself was critical, and Steinman's weeks of careful selection revealed knowledge that went beyond simple masonry. He'd spent 3 weeks examining stone from different sections of Meat Camp Creek, testing each piece with methods that seemed eccentric to observers. He would strike stones with a small hammer, listening to the ring. He would scratch surfaces with an iron nail, examining the powder produced. Most tellingly, he would carry promising specimens back to his temporary shelter and place them near his cooking fire overnight, then examine them the following morning for cracks or spalling. What he was testing for, though he lacked the vocabulary to explain it in thermodynamic terms, was specific heat capacity and structural integrity under thermal cycling. Sandstone, particularly the dense, fine-grained varieties found in certain creek bed deposits, has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.92 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. In practical terms, this meant those 4,000 pounds of carefully selected stone could absorb and store roughly 8 million joules of thermal energy during a single evening fire,
enough energy to theoretically heat his entire cabin volume by more than 40 degrees Fahrenheit if released instantaneously. For comparison, Bradley's conventional hearth, with perhaps 1,800 pounds of mixed fieldstone collected for convenience rather than thermal properties, could store less than 40% of that energy. Moreover, Bradley's stone included granite and limestone pieces with varying thermal properties. Some expanded rapidly under heat, creating stress cracks. Others had poor heat retention characteristics. The mismatched thermal expansion coefficients meant Bradley's hearth would eventually develop gaps and weaknesses. Steinman's uniform sandstone selection eliminated these problems while maximizing thermal storage. But mass alone wasn't the innovation, and this is where Steinman's design revealed sophistication that frontier builders had never considered.
Steinman positioned the firebox at a precise angle, not the standard perpendicular placement relative to the room that most frontier fireplaces used, but canted 15 degrees to maximize the radiant surface area visible from the cabin's sleeping quarters. This meant that someone lying in bed on the opposite wall would have direct line of sight to more of the heated stone surface. Radiant heat, unlike convective heat, travels in straight lines and warms objects directly without requiring air as a medium. By angling the firebox, Steinman increased the effective radiant surface area by approximately 30% for anyone positioned in the primary living and sleeping area of the cabin. The back wall of the firebox featured another crucial innovation. It sloped forward at 35 degrees rather than rising vertically. This seemingly minor detail had profound implications. In a standard vertical firebox, much of the fire's radiant energy traveled straight upward into the chimney, heating the flue stones and ultimately exiting to atmosphere. Steinman's angled back wall acted as a reflector, bouncing radiant energy forward into the room and into the thermal mass on the sides of the firebox. Modern testing of similar designs suggests this geometry increased radiant heat delivery into the living space by approximately 73% compared to conventional vertical designs, while also improving combustion efficiency by creating better airflow patterns within the firebox itself. The thermal mass extended in a U-shape around 3 sides of the firebox, with the 18-inch depth carefully calculated, though again, Steinman would have described this as the old measurement rather than as a calculation. This dimension wasn't arbitrary. Sandstone has a thermal conductivity of approximately 2.4 watts per meter Kelvin, meaning heat migrates through it at a specific, predictable rate. With 18 inches of mass, heat from an evening fire would conduct slowly from the hot inner surface toward the cooler outer surface over a period of 6 to 8 hours, exactly matching the duration of a winter night's sleep. During the intense evening fire, the inner surfaces of the firebox would reach temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat would begin conducting into the stone mass immediately, but the outer surfaces, the ones facing into the cabin, would heat gradually, reaching peak temperatures of 100 to 120 degrees around midnight, several hours after the fire had been reduced to coals. From midnight until dawn, those outer surfaces would cool slowly, radiating warmth into the cabin throughout the cold hours before sunrise, when temperatures dropped to their lowest point. Standard frontier fireplaces operated on an entirely different principle: immediate convective heating. Hot air from the fire rose and exited through the chimney, creating a draft that continuously pulled fresh air into the cabin through gaps in chinking, around doors, and through any available opening. This constant air exchange meant that frontier cabins were drafty by design. The fireplace needed that draft to function. It was a system optimized for quick warmth when you were sitting directly in front of the fire, but terrible at heat retention and catastrophic in terms of overall cabin comfort. The moment you stepped away from the immediate fireside, you entered a zone of cold drafts. The moment the fire died down, cabin temperatures plummeted. Steinman's design prioritized radiant heat over convective heating.
His family would sleep beside a 4,000-pound radiator that would maintain surface temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit until dawn, even as the fire reduced to ash. The heat didn't require air circulation. It radiated directly to bodies, bedding, and the cabin's log walls, which would themselves absorb and re-radiate warmth. The entire cabin became a thermal system rather than just a room with a hot spot in one corner. Moreover, Steinman's massive hearth actually reduced problematic draft. The large thermal mass absorbed much of the convective energy that would normally rush up the chimney, converting it to radiant heat instead. His chimney drew adequately for combustion, but without the fierce draft that made Bradley's cabin so uncomfortable away from the immediate fireside. Bradley and others saw waste: excessive stone, excessive labor, excessive space consumption. Steinman saw thermal physics that Black Forest villagers had refined over 5 centuries of alpine winters, where fuel was precious, forests were carefully managed, and surviving winter meant understanding how stone, fire, and geometry could work together to store summer's warmth and release it when families needed it most.
The knowledge encoded in his hearth's dimensions and stone selection represented hundreds of years of accumulated wisdom, thousands of individual heating seasons, countless experiments, though no one had called them experiments at the time, in what worked and what failed when children's lives depended on staying warm. The question was whether Appalachian cold would prove him right, or leave his family shivering beside an expensive stone monument to old-world stubbornness that didn't translate to American conditions. By mid-January 1837, the Watauga settlement had experienced a relatively mild winter by regional standards. Temperatures rarely dropped below 25 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to require steady fires and careful wood management, but nothing that tested heating systems to their limits. The Holston River hadn't frozen solid, livestock were surviving on winter forage supplemented with hay stores, and most families' firewood supplies remained adequate. And Bradley's predictions seemed to be holding true, which gave him considerable satisfaction. Steinman's family was comfortable, but they appeared to be burning wood at roughly the same rate as their neighbors, hardly the revolutionary efficiency the German had promised. Bradley made a point of asking about firewood supplies whenever he encountered Steinman at the settlement's communal mill, where neighbors ground corn and shared news. "Still got plenty of oak left?" he'd ask with barely concealed satisfaction, knowing his own substantial woodpile remained adequate despite consistent use. "That hearth keeping you warm enough?" The implication was clear. Steinman's excessive construction had produced mediocre results at excessive cost. Steinman would nod politely, saying little, offering no defense and making no claims. His reticence frustrated Bradley, who'd hoped for either admission of error or boastful claims he could later disprove. Anna Steinman, meanwhile, reported to the other settlement women during Sunday gatherings that they were indeed quite comfortable, though she struggled to articulate in English exactly how the hearth functioned. "The stone stays warm," she would say, gesturing with her hands to indicate duration. "All night. The children, they sleep without heavy blankets." The other women nodded politely, but the lack of dramatic difference gave ammunition to skeptics. "Comfortable burning the same wood as everyone else," they'd note to their husbands. "Lot of effort for the same result. I'm glad we didn't waste James's time building something so large." Samuel Perkins, who'd been particularly vocal in his criticism during construction, told anyone who'd listen that the mild winter had saved Steinman from discovering his error the hard way. "Wait until we get a real cold snap," Perkins predicted. "That oversized chimney will draft like a bellows, and he'll be burning twice what we burn just to keep up. The larger the fire, the more heat goes up the flue. It's basic sense." Then February arrived with a vengeance that frontier veterans would remember and recount for decades, the kind of weather event that becomes a benchmark for measuring all subsequent winters. February 9, 1837.
A massive cold front swept down from Canada, driven by atmospheric conditions that meteorologists would later classify as a polar vortex event, though no one in the Watauga settlement had vocabulary for such concepts. They simply knew that the wind shifted to the north, the sky cleared to a brittle blue-black, and the temperature began dropping with a speed that was almost audible in the way ice formed on water buckets and breath froze in beards. By February 11th, temperatures at Watauga had plunged to 17 degrees Fahrenheit, -8 degrees Celsius. Wind chill, a concept not yet formally defined, but viscerally understood by anyone who'd felt it, drove effective temperatures down near zero. Every gap in cabin chinking became a knife edge of cold air. Every poorly fitted door allowed drafts that snuffed candles and made floors frigid regardless of fire size. Livestock huddled in barns, their breath creating ice formations on walls. 2 families lost chickens despite having them inside coops banked with straw. And this wasn't a single-night event that families could endure through extra fires and determination. The cold snap would persist for 6 consecutive nights, testing every cabin's heating system to failure points, and exposing the difference between adequate design and truly functional thermal engineering. Bradley's cabin, built to proven frontier standards with his 15 years of experience encoded in every decision, became an inadvertent laboratory of suffering. His family kept the fire roaring from dusk until they collapsed near midnight from exhaustion, burning through nearly half a cord of split oak in those first 3 nights alone.
The firebox glowed, flames leaped. The immediate area around the hearth became almost uncomfortably hot. But 10 feet away from the fire, temperatures remained brutally cold. The fierce draft his fireplace created to sustain such large fires pulled cold air through every available gap, creating air currents that made the cabin feel even colder than the actual temperature. By 2 a.m. each night, despite banked coals still glowing in the firebox, interior temperatures would drop to the low 40s. By dawn, the coldest hours, when human bodies are naturally at their lowest temperature and most vulnerable, frost formed on the inside walls where moisture from breath and cooking had condensed and frozen. Bradley's children slept in layers of clothing under piled blankets, their breath visible inside the cabin, waking multiple times nightly as cold penetrated their bedding despite parents' best efforts at tucking and insulating. Bradley himself rose at least twice each night to rebuild the fire from coals, splitting his sleep into exhausting fragments. He would stumble from his bed, shivering despite wool nightclothes and heavy socks, blow on coals, add kindling, wait for flames, then add larger splits, wait for the fire to establish itself again, warm his hands and face briefly, then return to bed, where he'd lie awake for an hour worrying about wood supplies, about whether the fire would hold, about whether his children were warm enough. By the 4th night, he was haggard, his hands cracked from cold and rough wood, his temper short with exhaustion. His wife Martha was suffering equally. She'd worn wool stockings to bed every night, something she'd never needed to do before, and still woke with cold feet. The baby cried more frequently, disturbed by cold and by the disruption of Bradley's nighttime fire tending. Martha found herself calculating whether they had enough wood to sustain this level of burning if the cold persisted another week, and what they'd do if supplies ran out before spring arrived. Other families faced identical struggles. Perkins' cabin, built with similar specifications, was equally cold. The Robertsons, newcomers who'd built using local advice, spent one night all sleeping in a single bed for shared warmth. Parents, 3 children, and a dog, huddled together for survival. The settlement's usual nighttime silence was broken by the sounds of axes splitting wood, doors opening and closing as men tended fires, livestock distress calls, and the occasional cry of a cold child. On February 12th, during the 3rd night of brutal cold, Bradley noticed something that cracked his certainty like ice breaking on a frozen pond. It was near 10 p.m.,
and he was outside splitting additional wood for the night's anticipated burns, a task he'd been doing every evening, trying to stay ahead of consumption. Smoke from Steinman's chimney, visible in the clear, frigid moonlight, stopped completely around 10 p.m., meaning the German had let his fire die to embers far earlier than any reasonable person would during such cold. Bradley paused in his work, leaning on his axe, staring at that smokeless chimney. Steinman's cabin showed candlelight in the window. The family was clearly still awake, but no smoke, no fire being tended. Yet no sounds of distress came from that cabin. No door opening for emergency wood splitting. No frantic activity of the sort Bradley himself was engaged in. Just silence. Calm. Light visible through the window indicating normal evening activity. The following nights confirmed the pattern. Steinman's chimney would smoke steadily from roughly 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., then go dark, while other cabins' chimneys continued pouring smoke from fires being maintained through midnight and beyond. No sounds of children crying from cold, no middle-of-the-night wood splitting. The cabin simply went quiet, as if the family had achieved something other settlers could not: actual sleep during the worst cold snap in recent memory. By February 14th, after 5 nights of confirmed frigid torture, Thomas Bradley swallowed his pride in a way that required more courage than he'd needed for any physical task in his 15 years on the frontier. At dawn, exhausted and desperate for understanding, he approached Steinman's door with a question he'd never imagined asking. If you're finding this account valuable and want to preserve this kind of survival wisdom, hit that subscribe button right now. This is knowledge that literally meant the difference between sleep and suffering, between comfort and crisis. And drop a comment telling us, what's the coldest night you've ever tried to heat a cabin, old house, or inadequate shelter? What did you learn about the limits of conventional heating? Bradley waited near the door, gathering courage, watching smoke begin to rise from the chimney as Steinman built the morning fire.
When Steinman emerged to collect an armload of wood from his neatly stacked supply, a supply that looked barely diminished despite 6 days of cold, Bradley finally spoke. "Jacob," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion and cold nights breathing dry air, "I need to see inside your cabin. I need to understand what I'm seeing." There was no pride in the request, no defensiveness, just the raw humility of a man who'd been wrong and needed to know why. What Bradley found that morning of February 14th, 1837, would fundamentally alter heating practices across the Appalachian frontier for the next 2 decades and challenge every assumption he'd held about efficient cabin design. Steinman answered the door in a light wool shirt, no heavy layers, no leather vest, no visible shivering or hunched posture against cold. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, as if he had been engaged in normal morning tasks. Behind him, his 3 children sat eating cornmeal mush at the table, similarly dressed in single layers of everyday clothing, the kind of casual dress you'd expect during mild autumn weather, not during the worst cold snap in recent memory. No desperate bundling in blankets, no huddling near the hearth. The youngest child, 4-year-old Emma, was barefoot, her feet dangling from the bench as she ate. Bradley could feel warmth radiating from the doorway before he even stepped inside. Not the fierce, localized heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the cabin itself. "Come in," Steinman offered quietly, his accented English careful and welcoming. "The hearth is still warm from last night's fire." There was no smugness in his voice, no trace of vindication. He spoke as if he were simply stating an observable fact about the weather or the time of day. Bradley entered, and his experienced builder's senses, 15 years of evaluating cabin comfort, draft patterns, heat distribution, immediately registered multiple data points that conflicted with everything he understood about winter heating. The cabin's interior temperature felt close to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps 20 degrees Celsius. This wasn't an estimate born of wishful thinking,
Bradley had spent enough winters in enough cabins to gauge temperature within a few degrees. His own cabin at this same hour, despite banked coals still glowing sullenly in his hearth, barely maintained 42 degrees, a 26-degree differential. That was the difference between comfort and suffering, between sleeping soundly and waking repeatedly from cold. He placed his hand against the massive hearth's stone surface, expecting residual warmth at best. Instead, he found consistent, gentle heat radiating from every section of the exposed stone. The surface temperature was clearly above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm enough to hold his hand flat against it for more than a few seconds became uncomfortable. Some sections, particularly those closer to the firebox opening, felt closer to 100 degrees. Yet the firebox itself contained only gray ash and a few faintly glowing embers. No active flame, nothing that could be producing this much heat directly. "You let the fire die at 10 o'clock?" Bradley asked, touching different sections of stone, trying to understand the heat distribution pattern. "Yes, every night since the cold began." Steinman gestured to a modest stack of split oak in the corner of the cabin, firewood stored inside for convenience and to keep it dry. "That wood has lasted 6 days, perhaps a quarter cord. You are burning more?" Bradley knew exactly how much he'd burned because he'd been keeping mental count with growing anxiety. Nearly a cord and a half in those same 6 days, 6 times Steinman's consumption. And for that 6-fold fuel expenditure, his family was cold and exhausted, while Steinman's family had apparently slept comfortably through every night, uninterrupted, in light clothing. The disparity wasn't marginal, it was categorical. Bradley walked slowly around the cabin, observing details he'd missed during his initial assessment of comfort. The log walls themselves felt slightly warm to the touch, not hot, but noticeably warmer than exterior temperature would suggest. The floor near the hearth, even 10 feet away, was comfortable to walk on, no shocking cold seeping up through boards from frozen ground below. The air had no drafts, no cold currents slicing through gaps and chinking. The entire cabin felt like a unified warm space, rather than the typical frontier pattern of a hot zone near the fire, fading rapidly to cold zones in corners and along exterior walls. "How does the stone stay so warm?" Bradley asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer even as he posed the question. "The fire's been out for 7-8 hours." Steinman crossed to the hearth and placed his own hand on the stone, feeling the warmth as if checking that it met his expectations.
"The stone drinks the heat when the fire is strong," he explained, searching for English words to convey concepts he understood through practice rather than formal study. "Then it gives back the heat slowly, like a cistern gives back water slowly through a tap. You fill it fast, it empties slow." The analogy was crude but accurate. Bradley realized he was looking at thermal storage on a scale he'd never considered. During those 4 hours of evening fire, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., when Steinman burned his daily fuel, the flames had heated that 4,000 pounds of sandstone to extreme temperatures. The stone's mass had absorbed that heat energy and was now releasing it gradually through radiant emission. The process was invisible, but as real as water flowing from a spring. Bradley began asking more specific questions, and Steinman answered patiently, sometimes showing rather than telling. The firebox geometry became clearer upon close examination. The angled back wall that Bradley had dismissed as odd craftsmanship was actually positioned to reflect heat forward, rather than allowing it to escape upward. The 15-degree cant of the entire firebox assembly meant that people sitting or lying anywhere in the main living area had direct line of sight to warmed stone surfaces. In the old country, Steinman explained, speaking slowly to ensure his English was clear, many families, many winters, many tries with different designs. Stone holds warmth that air cannot hold. You heat the stone thoroughly once with a good fire, and it returns that gift slowly through the dark hours when you need it. He paused and then added with characteristic understatement, "It is not foolish if it works. My grandfather told me, build the hearth large enough, and you will sleep warm. Build it small to save labor, and you will work all night keeping fire alive. Which is truly wasteful?" Bradley had no answer.
He stood beside that massive hearth, feeling the radiant warmth, watching Steinman's daughter play on the floor in bare feet, and calculating the implications with the brutal honesty that frontier survival demanded. His 15 years of building experience, his certainty about proven methods, his dismissal of old-world techniques as excessive, all of it had been undone by physics he'd never considered and traditions he'd been too arrogant to examine before judging. By late February 1837, as temperatures moderated and the brutal cold snap gradually released its grip on the Appalachian highlands, Thomas Bradley did something that required more courage than building any cabin, more humility than admitting any ordinary mistake. At the settlement's monthly gathering on February 26th, a meeting held in the largest cabin where families assembled to share news, resolve disputes, and coordinate community efforts, Bradley stood before the assembled settlers and acknowledged publicly that he had been fundamentally wrong. The room fell quiet as he began to speak. Bradley was respected as one of the settlement's most experienced builders, a man whose opinions carried weight in matters of construction and frontier survival. Seeing him stand with visible fatigue, the toll of those sleepless, cold nights still evident in his face, commanded attention. "I want to talk about the cold week we just survived," Bradley began, his voice carrying the roughness of exhaustion, but also a kind of clarity that comes from having certainty stripped away by undeniable facts. Most of us in this room suffered through it the same way I did. Burning wood until we couldn't stay awake, waking cold, children crying, wives asking if we had enough fuel to last if the cold continued. And I want to talk about Jacob Steinman's hearth, the one I called wasteful, the one Samuel Perkins called foolish, the one we all agreed was excessive. He paused, letting his words settle, watching as people glanced toward Steinman, who stood quietly at the back of the meeting house beside Anna, their presence unobtrusive but suddenly significant. "I went to Jacob's cabin on February 14th because I couldn't understand what I was seeing. His chimney went dark at 10 o'clock every night, while mine was still pouring smoke until midnight. I thought maybe his family was suffering in silence too, proud to admit the hearth didn't work. But when I went inside..." Bradley's voice caught slightly. His cabin was warmer than mine had been all week. His children were in light clothing. The stone was still radiating heat 8 hours after the fire died. And he'd burned 1/4 the wood I'd burned to achieve 6 times the comfort. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Several men exchanged glances, perhaps remembering their own predictions about Steinman's design, their own certainty that they knew better. Bradley continued, his tone shifting from confession to something closer to advocacy. "Jacob tried to tell us something we weren't ready to hear. We thought bigger meant wasteful. We thought our frontier methods were proven. But what we didn't understand, what I didn't understand, was that he brought knowledge from people who'd been surviving mountain winters since before this country existed. His family's been building hearths in the Black Forest for 200 years. They weren't guessing. They weren't being excessive. They were being precise about something we've never had to think deeply about because we've always had more wood than we knew what to do with. This last point landed with particular force. The American frontier's abundant timber had indeed allowed settlers to develop heating strategies that prioritized convenience over efficiency. Why carefully design a hearth for maximum thermal retention when you could simply burn more wood? The answer, as the recent cold snap had demonstrated, was that extreme conditions eventually exposed the difference between adequate design and truly functional engineering. Samuel Perkins, who'd been among the most vocal critics during construction, stood up from his seat. The room tensed slightly, anticipating defensiveness or argument. Instead, Perkins said simply, "Tom's right. I was wrong too. I looked at that hearth and saw wasted labor. I should have asked why a man would invest that much effort unless he knew something I didn't." He turned toward Steinman, nodded respectfully, then sat back down. The gesture, brief, genuine, broke whatever tension might have developed into argument. The impact of Bradley's testimony was immediate and practical. Before the meeting concluded, 4 families had approached Steinman to ask about redesigning their hearths. By autumn of 1837, as families prepared for the next winter with memories of February still fresh, Steinman found himself contracted to consult or directly build modified hearth designs for cabins throughout the settlement. Some wanted complete rebuilds.
Others asked him to evaluate their existing hearths and suggest modifications that might improve thermal retention without full reconstruction. By winter of 1838, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated enlarged hearth designs based on Steinman's thermal mass principles. The results varied. Not every implementation was as successful as Steinman's original because not every builder fully understood the interdependencies between mass, geometry, stone selection, and firebox design. Some families added stone mass without adjusting firebox angles, gaining some benefit but not the full efficiency Steinman achieved. Others built adequate mass but used poor quality stone that cracked under thermal cycling. But even imperfect implementations delivered measurable improvements in comfort and fuel efficiency, validating the core principles. The German stonemason who'd been mocked as paranoid and wasteful became the most sought-after builder in the region, consulted not just on hearths but on any aspect of construction where thermal efficiency mattered. His reputation spread through the informal networks by which frontier communities shared information. Travelers' tales, letters to relatives in other settlements, merchants who moved between regions and observed different building practices. But the deeper transformation that occurred in the Watauga settlement was epistemological, a change in how people thought about knowledge itself. The community had learned a harder lesson than mere hearth design. They'd learned the cost of dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive simply because it differed from their recent experience. They'd learned that proven methods might only be proven for certain conditions, and that other conditions might require different solutions that seemed excessive until crisis revealed their necessity. Steinman's Black Forest ancestors had refined thermal mass hearth techniques over 500 years of alpine winters, conducting inadvertent experiments across thousands of cabins in hundreds of villages, selecting and preserving methods that actually worked when children's lives depended on staying warm. That wasn't backward thinking or old-world superstition. It was empirical engineering conducted across centuries, encoding solutions to problems that American frontier settlers were only beginning to encounter as they pushed into higher elevations and colder microclimates. The settlement's initial response to Steinman's design had reflected a kind of arrogance common to any group confident in its own methods, the assumption that recent success in familiar conditions translates to comprehensive understanding.
Bradley's 15 years of successful cabin building had indeed been successful, but successful within specific parameters: moderate cold, abundant timber, and a tolerance for discomfort that seemed normal because everyone shared it. Steinman's experience spanned different parameters: severe cold, precious fuel, and a cultural expectation that proper design should eliminate discomfort rather than merely make it tolerable. Modern building science would eventually catch up to Steinman's principles, though it would take decades. By the late 1800s, engineers would be quantifying thermal mass benefits with precise mathematics and laboratory testing, measuring specific heat capacities, thermal conductivities, and heat transfer coefficients. They would validate through scientific method what black forest masons had discovered through survival necessity. But in 1837, on the Appalachian frontier, the proof was simpler and more compelling: a family sleeping warmly in light clothing while others shivered in layers. 4,000 pounds of carefully selected sandstone, positioned and angled according to principles Bradley had never considered, storing and releasing heat according to physics that worked whether frontier builders understood them or not. Steinman himself never boasted about his vindication. Throughout his remaining years in the settlement, he would live until 1869, dying at age 72. He continued splitting wood, tending his hearth, and sleeping comfortably through winter nights with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd known all along that his methods were sound. He took on apprentices over the years, teaching the principles of thermal mass design to a younger generation. Some of his students became respected builders themselves, carrying Black Forest techniques deeper into American frontier regions. His hearth remained functional for more than 50 years after its construction. The cabin burned in 1891 during a lightning strike, but the hearth itself survived as a freestanding stone structure until it was finally dismantled in 1903 when the property was cleared for different use.
Visitors throughout those decades, hunters passing through, new settlers curious about the massive hearth they'd heard stories about, even a young engineer from Raleigh who came specifically to measure and sketch it in 1874, would place their hands on that stone structure and feel the same persistent warmth that had convinced Bradley on that February morning. Each visitor would hear some version of the story: how neighbors mocked the excessive design, how a cold snap proved everyone wrong, how the German stonemason's stubborn adherence to old techniques saved his family from suffering that others endured. The story became part of local folklore, retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always preserving the core lesson. Sometimes the old way survives, not because people are stuck in tradition, but because the old way works better than we realize until conditions test our assumptions to destruction. If this account has given you new respect for ancestral building wisdom and the hard-won knowledge encoded in traditional techniques, make sure you've subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button to help preserve these stories of frontier ingenuity and the survival strategies that kept families alive in conditions we can barely imagine today. And comment below: what traditional technique or old-world knowledge have you seen dismissed as primitive or outdated, only to prove more effective than modern alternatives when actually tested? The lesson of Jakob Steinmann's hearth endures far beyond thermal mass and sandstone, reaching into questions that remain relevant today. It reminds us that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. What our ancestors understood through centuries of survival, through generations of bitter trial and deadly error, through winters that killed the unprepared and validated the wisdom of those who listened to their elders, deserves careful study, not casual mockery. Sometimes innovation means rediscovering what was known before we forgot it, in our confidence that newer always means better. Sometimes the greatest waste isn't building something large, but building something inadequate, when your family's comfort or survival depends on getting it right the first time. And sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from the people who speak loudest or build fastest, but from those who bring with them the tested, proven, quietly confident wisdom of ancestors who survived conditions we pray we'll never face.